Hi, everyone, and welcome to Prof Talk Pod. This week, we're actually going to take a second to circle back to what we talked about last week and look into a little bit more into the idea of ungrading. If this is your first time listening, we're very glad you're here. My name is Becky Achen, and I am a professor of the practice and program director at the University of Kansas, as well as the owner of the Engaged Professor. And with me is my colleague and friend, Dr. Galen Clavio.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you again.
And we like to use the Prof Talk Pod just to talk about some of the issues going on for educators. Sometimes we focus more on in the classroom stuff. Occasionally, it's bigger picture items, and that's kind of where we're going this week. So, last week we spent some time unpacking the idea of ungrading, where we try to shift the focus in our classroom from grades to the idea of assessing learning and the learning process. And there are a lot of teachers at both the secondary education level as well as in higher ed who have tried to do that by shifting away from giving letter grades or even giving points at all and engaging students in the process of grading and having them kind of work together to determine what the student learned and was able to do and what grade that should come of that. And as we talked about that, Galen and I discussed some of the challenges that that might bring, especially in fields like science or math or accounting was a great example where there are sometimes correct answers and we need students to eventually be able to get there, and there are foundational concepts that we want to test our students on to make sure that they know them. And so there are definitely some challenges with doing so. Also, probably what really sparked the idea for circling back to that this week is that we are, and this is my experience. I don't know if it is Galen's or some of your all's experience or not, but hearing more and more about assessment, both at the individual classroom level, but then at the programmatic level, sometimes even at the department level and at the university level. And as part of that assessment, that assessment process, we have to determine how are we deciding if students have actually met these overall programmatic learning goals. Is our degree in professional performance or media and communications or sport management or accounting or whatever the field is actually leading to the learning outcomes that we think students are important for students who are graduating with our degrees. So that's kind of how we got to this. And after our discussion a couple weeks ago, Galen and I on the podcast actually went to an assessment workshop where I was starting to think about the way we were talking about assessment and how that ties in with some of this idea of ungrading. And so, Galen has been for quite a few years now in a more uh, administrative role. This is my first time working in administration and really thinking about program assessment. And so I'm curious, Galen, as you think about our idea of ungrading and how that fits with some of the things you've had to do or experiences you've had with program assessment, where do you think there's opportunities or additional challenges?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue because all the things we talked about last time in terms of how to think about ungrading if you're going to go down that pathway. I mean, there's back and forth about the efficacy of some of those approaches, but there's also some potential clear benefits depending on the type of topics and the types of disciplines that you're trying to teach. In the accreditation process, I think so much of it depends on what you're accrediting. Is this a general accreditation that's coming that the university is putting forward as part of their regional accreditation? Is it a program specific accreditation approach? One of the big criticisms of accreditation over time has been it's so focused on inputs. It's so focused on, what the qualities are of your faculty and what the syllabi say in those classes. And it's less focused on the outcomes. And this is where I think you can be very dedicated to the idea of ungrading as a philosophical approach to pedagogy. But then you run into the reality that because you're being largely evaluated by peers or peer faculty members, people from other institutions that are coming in and taking an outside look, unless it is abundantly clear and consistent, I think, across what your programs are that you're offering, you're probably going to run into issues where because those other you know institutions where those faculty are located are probably not engaging in this process, they may not view it as a reasonable approach, something that would warrant accreditation without reservations. And that I think really comes down to a philosophical dispute about what we should be looking at in accreditation to begin with. But again, going back to what I talked about last time, one of the issues on the ungrading front is like if you're removing any kind of objectiveness in terms of the outcomes and you're trying to center it more on the process with students, I don't know that there's a great way to effectively align that with outcomes or with inputs, because it's almost a third process that has to be considered separately from either of those things, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think the point about what are we talking about? Are we talking about AACSB accreditation, or Recreation Parks Administration have their own accreditation, or are we talking about Higher Learning Commission and looking at the university as a whole? I know when I just for the first time went through AACSB accreditation when I was at University of the Pacific last year, and that was an interesting process that, I think as I think about what we had to provide for evidence, I was providing grades on my students' projects in their marketing course as a means to assess whether students were meeting that requirement or not. Now, if I think about integrating ungrading into that, certainly my students would still have to get grades because the university still requires them. And it depends a little bit on how we want to view whether students, what's that percentage, that baseline percentage of a ability to be successful in that content area that we're looking at, and can we still use one assignment even if I graded that assignment with student input and student feedback on their learning during the process. So if I previously they were earning B's on that project, and then I switched to working with them to talk about the process and what they believe they learned, and did they believe they met the learning outcomes, and we agree that they get a B, is there a lot of difference there from submitting that outcome to AACSB standpoint? Maybe not. And so I think that it's probably not going to impact maybe that level of it, depending on how deep AACSB wants to dig into your assessment processes, which I've seen there, and I've seen after talking to colleagues, is a little bit different, like how deep that the reviewers get, because like you said, they're peer institutions, right? So if they've never dealt with this idea of grading or thought ungrading or thought through it, and you're telling them that, well, this is my, I don't have a rubric, right? My rubric
Right.
is we sit down and talk through how students feel they learn throughout the process, then that might be a struggle. And you might, I don't know that you would not pass accreditation, but you might get asked to really revisit that and try to still come up with a rubric in the ungrading process.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it really comes down to how are you structuring the paperwork that provides the keys to how your programs are operating, and how do those things sequence. And so you kind of have to look at it at three different levels. You have to have the macro level of here are the ultimate outcomes that our degree programs or our concentrations or whatever methodology you're using within your department. Here's what we want students to walk out of here learning. Can you provide a a snapshot of those learning outcomes and how well students have been able to match them in terms of their exit knowledge base and what they've been able to develop. And then, if you've got a department or a program that has decided to move in an ungrading set, you have to switch your rubrics. Now you're going from like a 4 or 5 stage rubric perhaps to a 2 stage rubric, where now you're looking at, if you can what's the line, it's like if you can remove distractors from the evaluative process, and grades end up being a distraction within that process because the focus is on the grade as opposed to the process of learning. Can you effectively describe that within the paperwork that backs up the courses that you're offering, not just the syllabus but also the overlying documents? Like, how does this course fit into the overall learning objectives that ultimately we're trying to get students to in the program? I think where a lot of schools and programs run into trouble on this is that, you've got some faculty who have decided to move towards ungrading or some variation therein, and you've got some who don't. And that, I think, is where a lot of accrediting bodies are going to struggle a little bit with trying to figure out how to handle all of this, because unless you've got good reasons why you've got certain classes taught with certain methodologies and others taught with other methodologies, it's going to look scattered. It's going to look unorganized. It may not be, but I think the problem is a lot of times we don't have time in higher ed administration to properly document what we're trying to do and to have all of those items available so that when you do have accreditation bodies coming in, they can clearly see how you've defined the educational processes, how they all fit in, and where they lead to, and then provide evidence that, yes, these are indeed having a positive effect on the way that students are learning and the way that they're processing information. I think that you have to, and it's very hard in higher ed. A lot of what we're talking about here is an individual professor making the decision, like, I'm going to go to an ungrading model. And it's like, great. As an undergraduate director currently, I would prefer to know that, because if I'm starting to get questions about, well, why is this professor acting this way or doing this, not just from students, but from other faculty, I need to be able to contextualize what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think with a lot of time, you take that on a macro level, if you're offering 50 classes a semester in your program, or 50 classes a year, maybe 25 a semester, how do they all align? Can you describe in detail what each leads to and how they add up to something that is greater than the sum of the parts? And I think with ungrading, what you're doing is you're introducing something that is appealing for some faculty, not appealing for others. Either have some consistency across the board with what you're offering, or at the very least be able to say, here's why this class is being taught this way, and here's why that's actually helping the learning objectives be attained by students by the time they get out of the program.
That I want to grab onto something you said there, because you said, as the director of undergraduate education, I would want to know that. Probably, maybe partially because you might think of this bigger picture idea of all the other things, all the other parts of the department, and the assessment piece, and as well as just buy-in from students and complaints. I imagine you get some of those from time to time from students. So if a faculty member was thinking this is a thing they might want to do, what would you want them to say, or how would you want them to approach you and help you kind of understand what they're thinking and why?
Well, I think with something like this, my perspective as an administrator is I try to be as flexible as I can in terms of dealing with faculty or graduate students that might be teaching, or adjuncts, and say, okay, here's what we want to get out of this class. Here's the learning objectives. Here's the assessments that we've decided make the most sense for this class. What are you doing in the classroom to, first of all, notify students that this is what we need to learn, for you to demonstrate the competency needed to get a grade that indicates that you pass? One of the issues we run into is, like, a student takes a class, if they don't really learn what we want them to learn, it makes it hard for them to then progress to the next level, because if they get to the next level and they don't have the knowledge that we needed them to learn in that first class, it really ends up being a struggle, because now you've got students that are falling farther and farther behind. So if a faculty member decided to approach me and say, I'm really interested in ungrading, I would first want to make sure that our definitions of ungrading are the same. Because what I've learned in higher ed is that sometimes you'll get people who hear a phrase or hear something and they'll be like, I'm going to do that. And then you actually dig into it and that's not what they're doing. And they don't even realize it. And so you have to have some organizational structure in terms of, here's what we are considering this approach. And it's the same thing with, like, faculty want to teach a seminar. It's like, well, what is a seminar? Seminar is not just sitting around and talking for 2.5 hours. Like, there's like specific things that I need you to do in teaching that. So that's the first step, is like, I want to make sure that the faculty member or the instructor that we have and me, as the person who is ultimately responsible for what we're doing at the undergraduate level, are on the same page. Then it's like, okay, we are on the same page in terms of this concept. Now, how do we apply it to what you're going to do? And I'm not just talking about at the broad level of, here's how we're going to try to generally approach these learning objectives. It's like, let's look at the work you're having them do in the classroom, and let's talk through that process. The traditional pedagogical approach in a lot of these classes is a linear teaching approach, where we take a topic or we take an item and we provide them information, we have them do readings, we give a lecture on it, then we ask them to do some kind of tangible work, whether that's a homework assignment or whether that's a project, and then we look at what they did and we assess, okay, how well did you learn what we taught? The nice thing about the ungrading process is, theoretically, now you have a loop where the grade is more dependent down the road in the whole class, since we still do have to give grades, as we talked about last time. The grade is about judging the student based upon their progress and their acquisition of the learning objectives that the course has set aside. one of the big issues we've had in general in at least some of the administrative areas that I've worked in is just having learning objectives. Like to you and me, it's like, well, we need learning objectives, of course. That's not how all faculty feel. And so you have to first get them to understand, like, the course, you may have an idea in your head what the course is supposed to do. That needs to be on paper so that students can verify. And then if you're going to change your grading and feedback loop to something that resembles ungrading, where you're focusing on process instead of outcome, how are you then addressing those learning objectives? That way students don't feel like they can just do whatever they want. And I also feel more confident in your ability as an instructor to provide the kind of feedback consistently that you need in order to make sure the students are making progress towards what we need them to learn. So those are some of the things I think about. And, I think this is where you can do workshops, you can do special process-driven items with instructors where you say, okay, if you want to go to this route, it might sound dynamite. You might have read a great article on it in Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle or whatever, but let's make sure that you are comfortable with the amount of work that is probably going to generate, because the downside from a learning process, but the upside from a work process for the instructor with the traditional model of grading is that they do the assignment and then you move on to the next thing. And if they didn't do the assignment well, the idea is, well, you better go back and learn that yourself. That's not how this process works. And that's where a lot of people, I think, get caught because they don't realize the amount of feedback that they are buying into by taking this approach.
Yeah, I've got about 100 things to regrade right now. So I can definitely understand how that would be a little bit difficult to think through and make sure that everybody's ready for that. And I'm curious to see, and I would love if somebody tries this, getting a whole department on board, because I do think that there's a lot of challenges when you have one instructor doing things one way and five other instructors in the same program who not even only maybe don't do it the same way, but maybe don't have the same respect or at least understanding of what the one professor is doing. I would say that I think it would be really difficult to get everybody on the same page and have everybody ungrading in a program because of the thing you just said,
Yeah.
which is it is a commitment if you're going to go all in for sure. I think there's little things that could be done. If you're going to go all in, it's a commitment, and asking 10 faculty or even a really small team of 3 faculty to agree to do that at the same time seems really difficult. But then from a program assessment perspective, that's, be easier to justify the approach if everybody was on board. I think that is
Right.
one of the challenges with this, generally speaking, right? Is that it's, first of all, it's crunchy anyway, right? Like, it's not something that you can just, this is the way you do it, and you do it this way, and it's exactly lined out for you. You kind of set up a process that you think works by thinking through the idea of ungrading, and that makes it even more difficult, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, this is one of those things. And again, I've expressed my reservations about ungrading on the last pod, so I'm not advocating for it. But I will say that if you're going to have, I think this is something that we need to at least have discussions with faculty on. And a lot of it, I think, is if you're a department leader or a program leader and you've got a faculty member, or even if you have 0 faculty members interested in this, but you think it might be applicable to some of the courses in your program, I would recommend, bring in someone from your campus's teaching and learning center, or do it yourself. Because I think as someone who leads a program, you should be comfortable enough talking about pedagogy and pedagogical practices that you can have an open conversation, and you call a meeting of faculty and say, look, I'm not saying anybody has to do this, but there are certain classes where this might be a fit. Would you be interested, and would you feel comfortable doing this? And then walk through what it is, how it would be applied. Take an example course and say, here's how this might work within the confines of what you're doing here, to that faculty member. And I think also, I will say, one of the things that can be a little bit of struggle, we have to use a large number of adjunct instructors in our program simply because we have so many students, and we don't have that number of faculty full-time to teach all of them. But it's a good thing in media, as it is in some other industries, because we get experts who work in the field who can provide a lot more specific technical or managerial details than perhaps a tenure track faculty member could. But the problem you run into in that circumstance is now you're taking people who are not professional educators in many cases, and you're having to work them up. And most of their experiences are going to be having been in classrooms that used a very traditional style of grading, because you're talking about people who were in school 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40 years ago. So you have to be careful. It's like, who are we leveraging within the confines of using ungrading in our classes and in our program? And can we make sure that if we have to switch to somebody who's not a professional educator, can we easily get them up to speed on how we do things? What's our method? What's our process as a program or as a school or as a department? And that's really, I think, again, going back to the accreditation overarching issue, so much of it is, can I codify what we do, why we do it, how it fits into the process of bringing students in who have limited knowledge in this particular topic. And by the time they graduate or get a credential with us, they will have acquired whatever the final learning objectives are, and they'll be able to utilize them moving forward. Being able to write all that out, being able to say, here's how this applies to this, and here's how these things filter into the process, that to me is the really important aspect of this whole thing. And I think there's no reason why you can't do it. It does require extra work, and it does require a commitment to it being a part of your process, not just something that you say, oh, by the way, we've got a couple of classes that do this. I think most administrators realize that, but it's something that faculty have to buy into as well, because faculty have to be able to explain it to an accrediting group that's coming in for review just as much as the administrator has to be able to explain it as well.
And I think that's kind of where I came at it from as I was thinking about this, sitting in that session, and our talk, right before that, about how one of the challenges with ungrading might be this accreditation issue. I actually think that is probably really a non-issue as long as you sit down and figure out how you are going to explain it to an accrediting body and still show, like, we this is still an assessment of student learning. We're assessing it slightly differently, and we have a process for it.
Right.
I think, well, a lot of times when faculty, maybe not as much administrators, but certainly faculty hear accreditation or program assessment. I know sitting in that room with even some program directors, they're like, "Oh, assessment. I'm so sick of hearing about assessment." But we aren't doing a very good job communicating that. That doesn't mean that you're proving that all of your students are graduating, meeting these outcomes. It's about, do you have a process for assessing it, and are you taking what you learned from that process and revising and editing and completing the feedback loop to improve what you are doing in your program. And I don't know that ungrading makes that any harder or less able to do, just because the process of how you're assessing students in that class. And so I think actually that is maybe even an opportunity to think through how we think about assessment from a
Mm-hmm.
more holistic perspective. I like when I sit in rooms where people say, you get to choose how you're assessing your program. There are a lot of different methods and models. We want you to understand that it's a process, and we want you to tie your learning objectives to your assessments and be thinking through these things as you create your assignments and as you evaluate your program. The assessment process is really about consistently evaluating and improving. And those conversations really made me think about, I've been in rooms and assessment discussions. I'm an assessment nerd. I should tell everybody that. Like, I was on the university assessment committee at Illinois State because I could be, not because anybody asked me to be. I just wanted to be. So I know that's kind of a weird thing to love, but I do love it. So one thing that I learned sitting in those rooms, as well as rooms over the years, is that some places are very number driven when
Right.
they're looking at assessment. They're like, we had 70% of students get a 70% or higher on these 4 exams and this final project, and that's how we know we're meeting our learning objectives. And, our goal is to get them up to 80% maybe someday.
Right.
But what I think the process of ungrading has made me think about as well is, are there other elements of assessment that maybe are more qualitative in nature that we can talk about? We know students don't come into our programs with all the knowledge they need. That's why they're in our programs. So, can we use some qualitative measures or some pre and post tests, some open ended student feedback to show that people learned? Because we also don't expect, I mean, I don't expect students to leave my degree program knowing everything they need to know to be a functioning member of society. I think that is a crazy thing to believe at 22. I still don't know everything I need to know to be a functioning member of society or to do my job. It's this continual learning process. So even though we're graduating in the accreditation and assessment process, we're showing that people have some competency to graduate. I also think it's about showing that they progress from A to B to maybe C and D, just depending on the student. And I think ungrading provides an interesting thought process on what can we add to our assessment that isn't just the numbers or the letter grades at the end of a semester.
And I think all of that's important. And ultimately, assessments from a programmatic perspective are really important as benchmarks. They're less important as actual descriptors of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, but I look at them more as they're snapshots essentially. And there's a lot of criticism about accreditation in general or assessment of programs, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, how do you evaluate how you're doing as a school or as a department or a program? You have to have some kind of benchmarks where you can compare, and that, I think, especially as we move into the area that we're moving into in higher ed, where it's an uncertain future in terms of the number of students that are coming to college, where they're going to college, what programs they're gravitating towards. Being able to fit different models of pedagogy and learning into the process is helpful. And I think, what I hate is when accreditation is a lot of work. Accreditation and program assessment is a pain in the ass for anybody that has to actually do it. But that's part of the deal when you get into these sorts of jobs. I would hate for accreditation to be used as a reason not to do something new and interesting when it comes to teaching. And so that's where, even though I'm not, in many cases, the hugest fan of ungrading in a lot of different types of classes, there are some where I do think it's helpful. And my advice to administrators as well as faculty who are interested in this is, don't let the prospect of some extra paperwork preclude you from pursuing something that might be more beneficial to students in certain circumstances, even if it runs counter to what you're doing elsewhere. I think you just have to work on the positioning, and that ultimately ends up being how you work it into what an external body of people reviewing your programs would look at and say, yes, this makes sense. Yes, this is appropriate. Yes, there's still good learning outcomes and there's good overall outputs coming out of this. And here's how they're positioning the resources that they've got in order to help service those things.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think the last macro thing that you just said that I just want to circle back to is, generally speaking, don't let program assessment or accreditation stop you from doing anything new. You can always figure out how to work it back in. Sometimes I think the idea of accreditation or assessment actually makes us be stuck in our ways, because if we change something, guess what we have to do? Update our assessment plans. But I think that, like you just said, there's always going to be a way to work it in. So, and that's why you talk to your administrative team and ask them ways that they think you can integrate whatever this new thing you want to try to still make program assessment and accreditation possible, but still be innovative and try new things.
Good.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Love to hear your comments or thoughts on the idea of ungrading, integrating with assessment, or any other questions you might have. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.